Mort, Part 2. Mort listened to the clatter of stone onto the horse's hooves. Then there was a soft thud of packed earth as they reached the road. And then there was nothing at all. He looked down and saw the landscape spread out below him, the night etched with moonlight silver. If he fell off, the only thing he'd hit was air. He redoubled his grip on the saddle. Then Death said, "Are you hungry, boy?" "Yes, sir." The words came straight from his stomach without the intervention of his brain. Death nodded and reined in the horse. It stood on the air, the great circular panorama of the disk glittering below it. Here and there a city was an orange glow. In the warm seas nearer the rim there was a hint of phosphorescence. In some of the deep valleys, the trapped daylight of the disk, which is slow and slightly heavy, was evaporating like a silver stream. A side note. Practically anything can go faster than disk light, which is lazy and tame unlike ordinary light. The only thing known to go faster than ordinary light is monarchy, according to the philosopher Lai Tin Weedle. He reasoned like this: you can't have more than one king, and tradition demands that there is no gap between kings. So when a king dies, the succession must therefore pass to the heir instantaneously. Presumably, he said, there must be some elementary particles, kingons or possibly queons, that do this job, but of course succession sometimes fails if, in mid-flight, they strike an antiparticle or republicon. His ambitious plan to use his discovery to send messages involving the careful torturing of a small king in order to modulate the signal were never fully expounded because, at that point, the bar had closed. But it was outshone by the glow that rose towards the stars from the rim itself. Vast streamers of light shimmered and glittered across the night. Great golden walls surrounded the world. "It's beautiful," Mort said softly. "What is it?" "The sun under the disk," said Death. "Is it like this every night?" "Every night," said Death. "Nature is like that." "Doesn't anyone know?" "Me, you, the gods." "Good. Is it?" "Gosh." Death leaned over the saddle and looked down at the kingdoms of the world. "I don't know about you," he said, "but I could murder a curry." Although it was well after midnight, the twin city of Ankh-Morpork was roaring with life. Mort had thought that Sheepreach looked busy, but compared to the turmoil of the street around him, the town was, well, a morgue. Poets have tried to describe Ankh-Morpork. They have failed. Perhaps it's the sheer zestful vitality of the place, or maybe it's just that a city with 1 million inhabitants and no sewers is a rather robust for poets who prefer daffodils, and no wonder. So let's just say that Ankh-Morpork is as full of life as an old cheese on a hot day, as loud as a curse in a cathedral, as bright as an oil slick, as colorful as a bruise, and as full of activity, industry, bustle, and sheer exuberant busyness as a dead dog on a termite mound. There were temples, their doors wide open, filling the streets with the sounds of gongs, cymbals, and, in the case of some of the more conservative fundamentalist religions, the brief screams of the victims. There were shops whose strange wares spilled out onto the pavement. There seemed to be a rather lot of friendly young ladies who couldn't afford many clothes. There were flares and jugglers and assorted sellers of instant transcendence. And Death stalked through it all. Mort had half expected him to pass through the crowds like smoke, but it wasn't like that at all. The simple truth was that wherever Death walked, people just kind of drifted out of the way. It didn't work like that for Mort, however. The crowds that gently parted for his master closed again just in time to get in his way. His toes got trodden on, his ribs were bruised, and people kept trying to sell him unpleasant spices and suggestively shaved vegetables. And a rather elderly lady said, against all the evidence, that he looked a well-set-up young lad who would like a nice time. He thanked her very much and said he hoped he was having a nice time already. Death reached the street corner, the light from the flares raising brilliant highlights and the polished dome of his skull, and sniffed the air. A drunk staggered up, and without quite realizing why, made a slight detour in his erratic passage for no visible reason. "This is the city, boy," said Death. "What do you think?" "It's, very big," said Mort uncertainly. "I mean, why does everyone want to live all squeezed together like this?" Death shrugged. I like it, he said. It's full of life. Sir? Yes. What's a curry? The blue fires flared deep in Death's eyes. Have you ever bitten a red-hot ice cube? No, sir, said Mort. Curry is like that. Sir? Yes. Mort swallowed hard. Excuse me, sir, but my dad said if I don't understand I was to ask questions, sir. Very commendable, said Death. He set off down a side street, the crowds parting in front of him like random molecules. Well, sir, I can't help noticing. The point is, well, the plain fact of it, sir, is... Out with it, boy. How can you eat things, sir? Death pulled up short so that Mort walked into him. When the boy started to speak, he waved him into silence. He appeared to be listening to something. There are times, you know, he said, half to himself, when I get really upset. He turned on one heel and set off down an alleyway at high speed, his cloak flying out behind him. The alley wound between dark wells and sleeping buildings, not so much a thoroughfare as a meandering gap. Death stopped by a decrepit water butt and plunged his arm at full length, bringing out a small sack with a brake tied to it. He drew his sword, a line of flickering blue fire in the darkness, and sliced through the string. I get very angry indeed, he said. He upended the sack, and Mort watched the pathetic scraps of sodden fur slide out to lie in their spreading puddle on the cobbles. Death reached out with his wide fingers and stroked them gently. After a while, something like grey smoke curled up from the kittens and formed 3 small cat-shaped clouds in the air. They billowed occasionally, unsure of their shape, and blinked at Mort with puzzled grey eyes. When he tried to touch one, his hand went straight through it, and it tingled. You don't see people at their best in this job, said Death. He blew on a kitten, sending it gently tumbling. Its meow of compliance sounded as though it had come from a long way away via a tin tube. They're souls, aren't they? Said Mort. What do people look like? People-shaped, said Death. It's basically all down to the characteristic morphogenetic field. He sighed like a swish of a shroud, picked the kittens out of the air, and carefully stowed them away somewhere in the dark recesses of his robe. He stood up. Curry time, he said. It was crowded in the Curry Gardens on the corner of God Street and Blood Alley, but only with the scream of society, at least with those people who are found floating on the top, and whom, therefore, it's wisest to call the cream. Fragrant bushes planted among the tables nearly concealed the basic smell of the city itself, which has been likened to the nasal equivalent of a foghorn. Mork ate ravenously, but curbed his curiosity and didn't watch to see how Death could possibly eat anything at all. The food was there to start with and wasn't there later, so presumably something must have happened in between. Mort got the feeling that Death wasn't really used to all this, but was doing it to put him at ease, like an elderly bachelor uncle who had been landed with his nephew for a holiday and is terrified of getting anything wrong. The other diners didn't take much notice, even when Death leaned back and lit a rather fine pipe. Someone with smoke curling out of their eye sockets takes some ignoring, but everyone seemed to manage. Is it magic? Said Mort. What do you think? Said Death. Am I really here, boy? Yes, Mort said slowly. I watch people. They look at you, but they don't see you, I think. You do something to their minds. Death shook his head. They do it to themselves, he said. There's no magic. People can't see me. They simply won't allow themselves to do it. Until it's time, of course. Wizards can see me, and cats. But your average human? No, never. He blew out a smoke ring at the sky and added, Strange, but true. Mort watched the smoke ring wobble into the sky and drift away towards the river. I can see you, he said. That is different. The Clatchian waiter arrived with the bill and placed it in front of Death. The man was squat and brown, with a hairstyle like a coconut gone nova, his round face creased into a puzzled frown when Death nodded politely to him. He shook his head like someone was trying to dislodge soap from his ears and walked away. Death reached into the depths of his robe and brought out a large leather bag full of assorted copper coinage, most of it blue and green with age. He inspected the bill carefully, then he counted out a dozen coins. Come, he said, standing up. We must go. Mort trotted along behind him as he stalked out of the garden and into the street, which was still fairly busy even though there was the first suggestion of dawn on the horizon. "What are we going to do now?" "Buy you some new clothes." "These were new today. Yesterday, I mean." "Really?" "Father said the shop was famous for its budget clothing," said Mort, running to keep up. "It certainly adds new terror to poverty." They turned into a wider street leading into a more affluent part of the city. The torches were closer together and the middens further apart. There were no stalls and alley-corner traders here, but proper buildings with actual signs hanging outside. They weren't mere shops. They were emporia. They had purveyors in them, and chairs and spittoons. Most of them were open even at this time of night, because the average Ankian trader can't sleep for thinking of the money he is not making. "Doesn't anyone ever go to bed around here?" said Mort. "This is a city," said Death, and pushed open the door of a clothing store. When they came out 20 minutes later, Mort was wearing a neatly fitting black robe with a faint silver embroidery, and the shopkeeper was looking at a handful of antique copper coins and wondering precisely how he came to have them. "How do you get all those coins?" Mort asked. "In pairs." An all-night barber sheared Mort's hair into the latest fashion among the city's young bloods, while Death relaxed in the next chair, humming to himself. Much to his surprise, he felt in a good humor. In fact, after a while he pushed his hood back and glanced up at the barber's apprentice, who tied a towel around his neck with that unseeing, hypnotized way that Mort was coming to recognize, and said, "A splash of toilet water and a polish, my good man." An elderly wizard was having a beard trim on the other side stiffened when he heard those somber, leaden tones and swung around. He blanched and muttered a few protective incantations after Death turned very slowly for maximum effect and treated him with a grin. A few minutes later, feeling rather self-conscious and chilly around the ears, Mort was heading back towards the stables where Death had lodged his horse. He had tried an experimental swagger. He felt his new suit and haircut rather demanded it, but it didn't quite work. Mort awoke. He lay looking at the ceiling where his memory did a fast rewind, and the events of the previous day crystallized in his mind like little ice cubes. He couldn't have met Death. He couldn't have eaten a meal with a skeleton with glowing blue eyes. It had to be a weird dream, right? He couldn't have ridden pillion on a great white horse that had cantered up into the sky and then went... Where exactly? The answer flowed into his mind with all the inevitability of a tax demand. Here. His searching hands reached up to his cropped hair and down to the sheets of some smooth, slippery material. It was much finer than the wool he was used to wear at home, which was coarse and always smelled of sheep. It felt like warm, dry ice. He swung out of the bed hastily and stared around the room. First of all, it was large, larger than the entire house back home. And it was dry as old tombs under ancient deserts. The air tasted as though it had been cooked for hours and then allowed to cool again. The carpet under his feet was deep enough to hide a tribe of pygmies and crackled electrically as he padded through it. And everything had been designed in shades of purple and black. He looked down at his own body, which was wearing a long white nightshirt. His clothes had been neatly folded on a chair by the bed. The chair, he couldn't help noticing, was delicately carved with skull and bones motif. Mort sat down at the edge of the bed and began to dress, his mind racing. He eased open the heavy oak door and felt oddly disappointed when it failed to creak ominously. There was a bare wooden corridor outside with big yellow candles set in holders on the far wall. Mort crept out and sidled along the boards until he reached a staircase. He negotiated that successfully without anything ghastly happening, arriving in what looked like an entrance hall full of doors. There were a lot of funeral drapes here and a grandfather clock with a tick like the heartbeat of a mountain. There was an umbrella stand behind it, and in it was a scythe. Mort looked around the doors. They looked important somehow. The arches were carved in the now familiar bones motif. He went to try the nearest one, and a voice behind him said, "You mustn't go in there, boy." It took him a moment to realize that this wasn't a voice in his head, but real human words that had been formed by a mouth and transferred to his ears by a convenient system of air compression as nature had intended it to. Nature had gone to a lot of trouble for 6 words with a slightly petulant tone to them. He turned around. There was a girl there about his own height and perhaps a few years older than him. She had silver hair and eyes with a pearly sheen to them, and the kind of interesting but impractical long dress that tends to be worn by tragic heroines who clasp single roses to their bosom while gazing soulfully at the moon. Mort had never heard the phrase pre-Raphaelite, which was a pity because it would have been almost the right description. However, such girls tend to be on the translucent, consumptive side, whereas this one had a slight suggestion of perhaps one too many chocolates. She stared at him with her head on one side and one foot tapping irritably on the floor. Then she reached out quickly and pinched him sharply on the arm. "Ow! Huh, so you're really real," she said. "What's your name, boy?" "Mortimer. They call me Mort," he said, rubbing his elbow. "What did you do that for?" "I shall call you boy," she said, "and I don't really have to explain myself, you understand. But if you must know, I thought you were dead." "You look dead." Mort said nothing. "Lost your tongue?" Mort was in fact counting to 10. "I'm not dead," he said eventually. "At least, I don't think so. It's a little hard to tell. Who are you?" "You may call me Miss Isabel," she said haughtily. "Father told me you must have something to eat. Follow me." She swept away towards one of the other doors. Mort trailed behind her at just the right distance to have it swing back and hit his other elbow. There was a kitchen on the other side of the door, long, low, and warm, with copper pans hanging from the ceiling and a vast black iron stove occupying the whole of one long wall. An old man was standing in front of it, frying eggs and bacon and whistling between his teeth. The smell attracted Mort's taste buds from across the room, hinting that if they got together they could really enjoy themselves. He found himself moving forward without even consulting his legs. "Albert," snapped Isabel, "another one for breakfast." The man turned his head slowly and nodded without saying a word. She turned back to Mort. "I must say," she said, "that with a whole disk to choose from, I should think Father could have come rather better than you. I suppose you'll just have to do." She swept out of the room, slamming the door behind her. "Have to do what?" said Mort, to no one in particular. The room was silent except for the sizzle of the frying pan and the crumbling of coals in the molten heart of the stove. Mort saw that it had the words "The Little Moloch" patented embossed on its own door. The cook didn't seem to notice him, so Mort pulled up a chair and sat down at the white scrubbed table. "Mushrooms," said the old man without looking around. "Huh? What?" "I said, do you want mushrooms?" "Oh, sorry, no thank you," said Mort. "Right you are, young sir." He turned around and set for the table. Even after he got used to it, Mort had always held his breath when he watched Albert walking. Death's manservant was one of those stick-thin, raw-nosed old men who always look as though they are wearing gloves with the fingers cut out, even when they are not, and his walking involved a complicated sequence of movements. Albert leaned forward, and his left arm started to swing slowly at first, but soon evolving into a wild, jerking movement that finally and suddenly, about the time when a watcher would have expected the arm to fly off at the elbow, transferred itself down the length of his body to his legs and propelled him forward like a high-speed stilt walker. The frying pan followed a series of intricate curves in the air and was brought to a halt just over Mort's plate. Albert did indeed have exactly the right type of half-moon spectacles to peer over the top of. "There could be some porridge to follow," he said, and winked apparently to include Mort in the world porridge conspiracy. "Excuse me, said Mort, "but where am I exactly?" "Don't you know? This is the House of Death, lad. He brought you here last night." "I sort of remember, only..." "Well, the bacon and eggs," said Mort vaguely. "It doesn't seem, appropriate." "I've got some black pudding somewhere," said Albert. "No, I mean..." Mort hesitated. "It's just that I can't see him sitting down to a couple of rashers and a fried slice." Albert grinned. "Oh, he doesn't, lad. Not as a regular thing, no. Very easy to cater for, the master. I just cook for me and..." He paused. "The young lady, of course." Mort nodded. "Your daughter," he said. "Mine? Ha!" said Albert. "You're wrong there. She's his." Mort stared down at his fried eggs. They stared back from their lake of fat. Albert had heard of nutritional values and did not care much for them. "Are we talking about the same person?" he said. At last. "Tall, wears black, he's a bit skinny." "Adopted," said Albert kindly. "It's a rather long story." A bell jangled by his head. "Which will have to wait. He wants to see you in his study. I should run along if I were you. He doesn't like to be kept waiting." "Understandable, really. Up the steps and first door on the left. You can't miss it. It's got skulls and bones around the door," said Mort, pushing back his chair. "They all have, most of them," sighed Albert. "It's only his fancy. He doesn't mean anything by it." Leaving his breakfast to congeal, Mort hurried up the steps along the corridor and paused in front of the first door. He raised his hand to knock. "Enter." The handle turned on its own accord, and the door swung inward. Death was seated behind a desk, peering intently into a vast leather book almost bigger than the desk itself. He looked up as Mort came in, keeping one calcareous finger marking his place, and grinned. There wasn't much of an alternative. "Ah," he said, and then paused. Then he scratched his chin with a noise like a fingernail being pulled across a comb. "Who are you, boy?" "Mort, sir," said Mort. "Your apprentice. You remember?" Death stared at him for some time. Then the pinpoint blue eyes turned back to the book. "Oh, yes," he said. "Mort. Well, boy, do you sincerely wish to learn the uttermost secrets of time and space?" "Yes, sir. I think so, sir." "Good. The stables are around the back. The shovel hangs just outside the door." He looked down. He looked up. Mort hadn't moved. "Is it by any chance possible that you fail to understand me?" "Not fully, sir," said Mort. "Dung, boy. Dung. Albert has a compost heap in the garden. I imagine there's a wheelbarrow somewhere on the premises. Get on with it." Mort nodded mournfully. "Yes, sir, I see, sir." "Sir?" "Yes." "Sir, I don't see what this has to do with the secrets of time and space." Death did not look up from his book. "That," he said, "is because you are here to learn." It is a fact that, although the death of the Discworld, in his own words, an anthropomorphic personification, he long ago gave up using the traditional skeletal horses because of the bother of having to stop all the time to wire the bits back on. Now his horses were always flesh and blood beasts from the finest of stock, and Mort learned very well fed. Some jobs offer increments. This one offered, well, quite the reverse, but at least it was in the warm and fairly easy to get the hang of. After a while he got into the rhythm of it and started playing the private little quantity surveying game that everyone plays in these circumstances. Let's see, he thought. I've done nearly a quarter, let's call it a third, so when I've done that corner by the hayrack, it'll be more than half. Call it 5/8, which means there are 3 more wheelbarrow loads. It doesn't prove anything very much, except that the awesome splendor of the universe is much easier to deal with if you think of it as a very series of small chunks. The horse watched him from its stall, occasionally trying to eat his hair in a friendly sort of nibble. After a while he became aware that someone else was watching him. The girl, Isabel, was leaning on the half-door, her chin in her hands. "Are you a servant?" she said. Mort straightened up. "No," he said, "I'm an apprentice." "That's silly. Albert said you can't be an apprentice." Mort concentrated on hefting a shovelful into the wheelbarrow. 2 more shovelfuls, call it 3, if it's well pressed down, and that means 4 more barrows, all right, call it 5, before I've done halfway to the... "He says," said Isabel in a louder voice, "that apprentices become masters, and you can't have more than 1 death, so you're just a servant, and you have to do what I say." And then 8 more barrows means it's all done by the way to the door, which is nearly 2/3 of the whole thing, which means, "Did you hear what I said, boy?" Mort nodded. "And then it'll be 14 more barrows, only call it 15 because I haven't swept up properly in the corner, and... Have you lost your tongue?" "Mort," Mort said mildly. She looked at him furiously. "What?" "My name is Mort," said Mort. "Or Mortimer, most people call me Mort. You want to talk to me about something?" She was speechless for a moment, staring from his face to the shovel and back again. "Only I've been told to get on with this," said Mort. She exploded. "Why are you here? Why did father bring you here?" "He hired me at a hiring fair," said Mort. "All the boys got hired, and me." "And you wanted to be hired," she snapped. "He's death, you know, the Grim Reaper. He's very important. He's not something you become. He's something you are." Mort gestured vaguely at the wheelbarrow. "I expect it'll turn out for the best," he said. "My father always says things generally do." He picked up the shovel and turned away, and grinned at the horse's backside as he heard Isabel snort and walk away. Mort worked steadily through the 16th, 8ths, quarters, and thirds, wheeling the barrow out through the yard to the heap by the apple tree. Death's garden was big, neat, and well tended too. It was also very, very black. The grass was black, the flowers were black, black apples gleamed along the black leaves of the black apple tree. Even the air looked somewhat inky. After a while, Mort thought, he could see... No, he couldn't possibly imagine he could see different colors of black. That's to say, not simply very dark tones of red and green or whatever, but real shades of black. A whole spectrum of colors, all different and all, well, black. He tipped out the last load and put the barrow away and went back to the house. "Enter." Death was standing behind the lectern, poring over a map. He looked at Mort as if he wasn't entirely there. "You haven't heard of the Bay of the Mont, have you?" he said. "No, sir," said Mort. "Famous shipwreck there." "Was there?" "There will be," said Death, "if I can find the damn place." Mort walked around the lectern and peered at the map. "You're going to sink the ship?" he said. Death looked horrified. "Certainly not. There will be a combination of bad seamanship, shallow water, and a contrary wind." "That's horrible," said Mort. "Will there be many drowned?" "That's up to fate," said Death, turning to the bookcase behind him and pulling out a heavy gazetteer. "There is nothing I can do about it. What is that smell?" "Me," said Mort simply. "Ah, the stables." Death paused, his hand on the spine of the book. "And why do you think I directed you to the stables? Think carefully now." Mort hesitated. He had been thinking carefully in between counting wheelbarrows. He'd wondered if it had been to coordinate his hand and eye, or teach him the habit of obedience, or bring home to him the importance on the human scale of small tasks to make him realize that even great men must start at the bottom. But none of these explanations seemed exactly right. "I think," he began. "Yes." "Well, I think it was because you were up to your knees in horse shit, to tell you the truth." Death looked at him for a long time. Mort shifted uneasily from one foot to the other. "Absolutely correct," snapped Death. "Clarity of thought, realistic approach, very important in a job like ours." "Yes, sir." "Sir?" Death was struggling with the index. "People die all the time, sir, don't they? Millions. You must be very busy, but..." Death gave Mort the look he was coming to be familiar with. It started off as blank surprise, flickered briefly towards annoyance, called in for a drink at recognition, and finally settled on vague forbearance. "But..." "I'd have thought you'd been, well, out and about a bit more, stalking the streets. My granny's almanac got a picture of you with a scythe and stuff." "I see. I'm afraid it's hard to explain unless you know about point incarnation and node focusing. I don't expect you do." "I don't think so." "Generally, I'm only expected to make an actual appearance on special occasions." "Like a king, I suppose," said Mort. "I mean, a king is reigning even when he's doing something else, or asleep, even. Is that it, sir?" "It'll do," said Death, rolling up the maps. "And now, boy, if you've finished the stable, you can go and see if Albert has any jobs he wants doing. If you like, you can come out the round with me this evening." Mort nodded. Death went back to his big leather book and took up a pen, stared at it for a moment, and then looked up at Mort with his skull on one side. "Have you met my daughter?" he said. Yes, sir," said Mort, his hand on the doorknob. "She is a very pleasant girl," said Death, "but I think she quite likes having someone of her own age around to talk to." "Sir?" "And of course one day this will all belong to her." Something like a small blue supernova flared for a moment in the depth of his eye socket. It dawned on Mort that, with some embarrassment and complete lack of expertise, Death was trying to wink.